You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is an internationally renowned journal for discussing ecology of fire. It is published by Springer Nature and run by the Association for Fire Ecology. We are going to be talking about a really fun paper today. The paper is Vegetation Fuel Fire Feedbacks and Patches of Longleaf Pine Regeneration. And we got three of the authors here today, so I'm very pleased that we got three people ready to talk about this paper. We've got George Jensen, Ben Knapp, and Jeff Cannon. George, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is George Jensen. I coordinate the Southwest Georgia Prescribed Burn Association and work at Tall Timbers Research Station.
Ben, you're up next.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, my name is Ben Knapp, and I'm an associate professor of silviculture at the University of Missouri.
And let's hear it from Jeff.
Hi, Bob. I'm Jeff Cannon. I'm a landscape ecologist. I work at the Jones Center at Itchaway.
Can't believe how pleased I am that you three joined us to talk about this paper. George, why don't you give us a quick and dirty rundown on what the paper's all about?
Thanks, Bob. A quick rundown of this paper is understanding how structural complexity is developed and maintained can enhance understanding of the ecology and restoration of fire-maintained ecosystems. Our study looks at how one of the most fire-promoting pines utilizes fire fuel feedbacks to persist in a fire-adapted forest, comparing both gap phase regeneration and single tree regeneration for changes in these fuels, fire behavior, and fire effects. We found some interesting results. Patches of longleaf pine and gaps do see a measurable alteration in fuel composition and a reduction in fire behavior and effects.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, Ben, why did you do this paper? What's the background?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. When we think about longleaf ecosystems, there's been a lot of research on fire. It's well understood fire is very important for the functioning of the ecosystems. And over the years, there's been developed some pretty in-depth looks at how fire, fuels, and vegetation all interact to affect the ecosystem function. From a tree regeneration perspective, a lot of times we see longleaf seedlings aggregated within patches that can be pretty dense. A lot of times within canopy gaps, this kind of gap phase regeneration, high density of seedlings within these groupings. And there's been research to look at competition effects that kind of lead to that spatial aggregation of the seedlings, but also the effect of fire and the observations that fire perhaps burns more with greater intensity underneath intact canopies because of the fuels, and that can affect seedling mortality and lead to some of these patterns. So we wanted to explore that more fully and take the opportunity to look at these conditions of both seedlings or saplings that are growing by themselves in an intact canopy versus clustered in groups, and try to really measure the fuels, the fire behavior itself, and the fire effects to kind of pull this apart and look at those impacts. So really getting a better understanding of the patterning of seedlings and the better understanding of the fuel fire vegetation dynamic.
I know a lot of longleaf pine enthusiasts want to hear all about this paper, but Jeff, can you tell us about the study and a little more about longleaf pine?
Yeah, this experiment was done at the Jones Center at Itchaway, which is a really great place for doing conservation research, especially around fire ecology. Historically, it was a hunting estate that's now a research center, and so it's really nice for doing these kind of fire ecology experiments. It's a total of 30,000 acres, and it's divided into burn blocks that are about 100 to 200 acres in size. And so George was really able to do this nicely replicated experiment in multiple of these burn blocks, and they're all at this operational scale, which is really useful for generalizing his findings to management. And the species he studied, longleaf pine, was once covered much of the southeast, but now down to only about 5% of its historic range. Fire, of course, is important for supporting biodiversity in the ecosystem, and there's lots of interest in restoring it and using fire for natural regeneration. And so the study of George really helped pull those two themes together of the fire ecology of longleaf pine and the regeneration ecology to start understanding how they interact.
Yeah, that's really nice. Thank you. So, George, what's special about this paper? Why is this paper different from a lot of other longleaf pine regeneration studies?
That's a great question, Bob. We can really narrow it down to three main things that kind of make this paper special. The first thing, as Ben and Jeff both mentioned, is that we took it all the way from fuel loadings to fire behavior to fire effects. So we kind of saw the whole process, which is a great opportunity to get some follow-up on what's actually happening. The second thing that makes this paper fascinating is we had a large sample size. We had 10 destructive samples and then 8 separate prescribed burns, 8 replicates of 8 separate burns burns with slightly different weather parameters at, as Jeff said, on that operational scale of about 1 to 200 acres. And so just the opportunity alone to have such a large scientific research area is fascinating to me, and I hope will be fascinating to the readers of this paper. We also did a paired approach for these 8 replicate burns. And so in those 1 to 200 acre stands, as close as spatially possible that made sense within our methods, we had a single tree regeneration and a patch to compare to. So we did that 8 separate times over 8 separate burns. And I really have to give a thank you to the land management staff at the Jones Center at Itchaway for working with me and giving me the time to actually set up these 8 replicants in 8 of their burns, which they didn't have to do, but definitely gave me every available opportunity to do that. And finally, we incorporated both that destructive and non-destructive sampling through photo loading where we could in our study. And so it was convenient to do the non-destructive photo load sampling in our 8 replicate burns, but we also had 10 replicates of destructive sampling to really dial in the fuel load and the differences between the patches and single tree regeneration of longleaf pine.
This is definitely a data-rich study. It's very impressive how many permutations you have of this. Wonderful, wonderful results. And speaking of results, Jeff, you want to give us a quick and dirty, we already heard some results, but what else did you find?
First of all, like we said, this was done at a really large scale and required a lot of fuel observations. And of course, as soon as you destructively harvest the fuels, you could change the fire behavior. So George developed a photo load method, and turns out it worked really well. We first learned of that, of course, from a lot of your early work, Bob. So he built on that and developed some of his own photo loads for our system that worked well. In terms of the amount of fuel, it was really similar, regardless of if regeneration appeared as a single individual versus if it appeared as patches. But the composition of the fuel was different. So underneath the patches, we saw a lot less grass and a lot more leaf litter. And then the single trees, we had less leaf litter and more grass. So we had these trade-offs in the fuel composition. In terms of how that fuel change altered the fire behavior, we also saw changes there. So when fire moved through patches, it tended to have a lower residence time and a little bit less energy release based on this time and temperature index. And we think that's because underneath the patches of regeneration, there tend to be increased shade, maybe some capturing of humidity and moisture. And so those fuels take a little bit longer to dry out and equilibrate with the ambient conditions. And so whenever we looked at these groups of trees after burns, we saw that scorch of those trees, which is a good predictor of mortality, was pretty low, especially on the downwind side. And so we think as fire approached patches, it died down pretty quickly. And so aggregated patches of regeneration actually protective cluster. But what we don't know, what remains is, how many trees in a patch does it take to actually start altering the fire behavior from what you see from individual trees, which is some of the next questions that we want to answer.
Really cool stuff. There's one question I ask. Usually I always end on this question. How can these results be used in management? And I'd like all 3 of you to give me an idea. Ben, why don't you start off? How can these results be used?
That's a good question, and I always like to think about the implications in our studies for use and for management. So I'm coming from a silvicultural perspective and thinking about some of the practices and approaches used with longleaf pine. And certainly there's a lot of interest in maintaining multi-age stands and canopy cover and the spatial complexity in terms of regeneration and recruitment across those stands. So thinking about uneven age selection, silviculture systems, the idea that longleaf pine will establish, and a lot of times in a good seed year, a masting year, you'll get a lot of seedlings that establish on the ground. And then the results from this study give us a better idea of how fire is influencing the persistence of those seedlings, the survival of those seedlings, and then the development of those stands. And some approaches in terms of thinking about silviculture would be some release of these seedlings, removing canopy trees through harvest, finding these kind of patches that are establishing a region, and doing selection removal to release those patches, allowing those trees to continue to grow, but also survive and have these dense patches of seedlings, understanding how that's going to influence the fire dynamics in the future. That fits well with some of the approaches used for multi-age longleaf pine ecosystems. So I think it's helpful reinforcing kind of result for thinking about kind of scaling up to the silviculture and the overstory trees.
From a management point of view, there's really 2 main things that I want to touch on. The first one is, as Jeff said, we don't really know the critical mass at which these effects take place, but there's been a lot of talk about underplanting longleaf pine and the potential successes or downfalls and really doing a service to the tree by fouling its silvics. And so I think some form of planting in groups for that kind of resistive effect of the fire is potentially a cool finding from this paper. Also, sometimes as we're driving around Southwest Georgia and around, we see some pre-commercial thinning or mowing of these patches or domes of longleaf pine. And I think this paper goes far to say potentially leave them alone for a while to let them have this protective effect. I think it's important, and it helps increase the survivability overall of the tree, because those domes are basically a better chance of having an insurance policy, if you will, one or two trees fill in that gap. And that mimics the Stoddard-Neal method of single tree selection and creating gaps and letting regeneration come in.
Jeff, anything to add before we say goodbye?
One thing, as a landscape ecologist, we think a lot about what causes spatial pattern and what are their effects. In terms of restoration, if you look at a planted longleaf pine stand, the structure looks very different than what you might see eventually in a mature natural stand. The planted stand is usually very homogeneous. All the trees are the same size and in rows, and a mature stand is much more complex with multi-age structure. Like Ben said, looking at the silvics of trying to manage that multi-age stand. And so an important restoration question is, how can we help accelerate the development of that multi-age structure, with the assumption that a lot of the ecological benefits and ecological interactions are going to be strengthened in that natural structure system. So we kind of ask, how can we help that process along? George's study is really nice because it provides some spatially explicit information about how regeneration occurs. And so one of the broader goals of this line of research is to try to identify some of the spatial interactions. How do the arrangement of trees change fuel? How does fire move through the system? How and where does regeneration occur and survive? Answering those questions will give us a really good view of how the ecosystem develops into that complex structure over time. And George's study was a really important puzzle piece on understanding how regeneration survives in its early stages.
I want to thank you guys. This has been a meaty podcast full of great interpretations of the data and all that stuff, and I really appreciate it. George, would you like to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies?
Yes, Bob, thank you. I really want to firstly thank our co-author who couldn't make it, Seth Bigelow from Tall Timbers Research Station. Seth is a fantastic writer and honestly just a great scientist, and I'm lucky to know him as well as the other two scientists on this paper. I really want to thank the Jones Center Conservation staff again for all their hard work. I could not have done this paper without such flexibility and forethought and caring on their end. And finally, I want to thank the University of Missouri and the Jones Center formally for sponsoring this research and myself in my graduate program. Thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you three for your time today talking about this very interesting paper. I surely appreciate it. For those of you listening, if you're interested on this paper, guess what? You can download it for free, because George and his crew have already paid for the freight to go ahead and give that article to you for free from the Fire Ecology website. Thanks again, everyone, and please tune in again to the next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FireEcology.org.